The crimson sunset painted the Texas sky as dusty winds swept over the cracked earth. Jeremiah Hawkins stood beside a shrinking muddy puddle, watching his black stallion Shadow drink slowly. The horse's reflection trembled in the murky water as if sharing in Jeremiah's sorrow. Tomorrow Jeremiah would sell Shadow. His heart wasn't ready, but his empty wallet had made the choice for him. Looking at the horse brought back memories of his wife Eliza, 5 years gone now, who used to brush Shadow's coat while humming old country songs. It reminded him of his daughters who had ridden bareback through summer fields, their laughter floating on the breeze before they grew up and moved away to cities where rain fell regularly. The ranch had once vibrated with life. Now it was just dust and debt. The drought had taken everything in stages, first the crops, then the cattle. Shadow was the last piece that made Jeremiah feel whole. A man from Odessa was offering barely enough money, but at this point, enough was enough. But then something strange happened. After drinking, Shadow didn't walk away. Instead, he began to paw at the ground beside the puddle, striking the earth again and again as if something lay buried beneath. Jeremiah frowned. In all their years together, Shadow had never done anything like this. The old rancher stepped closer, his heart beginning to pound for reasons he couldn't explain. The rhythmic sound of hooves hitting hard soil echoed like a heartbeat underground. Shadow kept digging until the dry earth cracked open, revealing a strange dark patch. Jeremiah knelt with stiff knees, his hands trembling as he brushed away loose dirt. His fingers touched something thick and slick. A sharp metallic scent filled his nose. He froze. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." But deep down he already knew. That smell, that color, that feel, it was oil. Shadow let out a sharp, echoing whinny, standing tall like a sentinel over his discovery. Jeremiah remained on his knees, staring into the shallow hole as if looking into the face of a ghost. His eyes filled with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Wild, terrifying hope. He wasn't going to sell that horse. Not now. Not ever. Jeremiah didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table staring at an untouched cup of black coffee, his mind spiraling with possibilities. Outside, stars blinked faintly over the dying fields, but he couldn't take his eyes off the memory of what Shadow had revealed. The possibility danced through his mind like a dangerous promise. Could it really be? After all these years of struggle, after watching everything he built crumble to ash, was salvation lying just a few feet below his boots the whole time? By morning the air hung thick with heat and doubt. Jeremiah walked back to the spot, half expecting it to have been a dream. But there it was, the shallow hole Shadow had dug, now surrounded by hoof prints and loose dirt. He knelt down again, pushing his fingers into the dark, slick mud. That smell was unmistakable. It clung to his skin, sharp and earthy, like something ancient finally breaking free. He stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans and looked over at Shadow, who stood nearby, calm and quiet as if he knew everything had changed. Jeremiah didn't trust himself to believe it yet. Too many things in his life had turned to dust before his eyes. He called Marcus Thornton, a friend from high school who now worked with a small energy company in Lubbock. They hadn't talked in years, not since Eliza's funeral. But Marcus picked up on the first ring. "You found what?" he asked, voice cracking with disbelief. "Oil, I think. On the north pasture. My horse found it." There was silence, then a low whistle. "I'll be there by morning." That night, Jeremiah walked the fields with Shadow at his side, the lead rope loose in his hand. He whispered apologies to the horse. "I was going to sell you, boy. God help me." Shadow nudged his shoulder gently as if he forgave him already. Jeremiah stopped walking and knelt down, resting his forehead against the horse's warm neck. Tears came then, hot, quiet ones that rolled down his face and into the dust. He didn't fight them. The next morning, Marcus arrived in a dusty pickup, stepping out with a grim expression that shifted fast when he saw the sight. He crouched beside the hole, scooped some of the black earth into a jar and gave it a long sniff. "You weren't lying," he said slowly. "Jeremiah, this could be big. Real big." Jeremiah felt the world shift beneath his feet. For a moment he didn't speak. He just looked at Shadow, who stood under the same dry sun, patient and still, like he'd always known the truth buried beneath the dust. But Marcus's next words weren't what Jeremiah expected. He stood up, eyes narrowing. "But if this is what I think it is, you've got more than oil. You've got a problem, and not just with the land." Jeremiah's heart skipped. A shadow passed over the field, though no cloud was in sight. Shadow snorted softly. Something deeper was beginning to rise. Something no one had been ready to dig up. Jeremiah leaned against the fence post, watching as Marcus moved methodically around the site, taking samples, marking coordinates, and speaking into a small voice recorder. The sight of oil had shifted something in the air. But now it wasn't hope Jeremiah was breathing. It was caution. Marcus hadn't said much after that last sentence, but the weight in his voice stuck with Jeremiah like dust in his throat. "What did you mean?" Jeremiah had asked. Marcus had only replied, "This land has a history, Jeremiah. And if you hit something valuable out here, others are going to come looking." Memories began bubbling up from a place Jeremiah thought he'd buried for good. His father's warnings, old deeds written in faded ink, whispered conversations on the porch when they thought the children were asleep. The north pasture had always been left alone, not because it was barren, but because something about it made people uneasy. Jeremiah never questioned it too deeply. He figured it was just superstition, ranchers holding on to old ghost stories. But now, standing over oil, he wondered if it had all been real warnings wrapped in folklore. Later that afternoon, Marcus pulled out a folded county map from his truck and laid it over the hood. "You ever look at the mineral rights on this place?" he asked. Jeremiah shook his head. "This land's been in my family for generations. Never thought to check." Marcus nodded, tracing lines with his finger. "That's what worries me. Some of this land, especially this section right here, was disputed decades ago. There were legal fights, even some threats of violence. The records are incomplete. If you found oil on disputed ground, Jeremiah, someone else might have a claim to it." Jeremiah's hands curled into fists as he stared down at the map. He didn't need this. He couldn't afford a legal battle. Not now. Not when he'd finally tasted the smallest hint of salvation. Shadow, standing nearby, pawed gently at the ground, drawing Jeremiah's gaze. He walked over and ran a hand down the horse's neck. "I'm not losing this," he muttered. "Not again. Not this time." Shadow blinked slowly as if in agreement. Just before sunset, Marcus closed his notebook and looked at Jeremiah with a tight jaw. "I'll run the test tonight. But I'll be honest with you. If this pans out, things are going to get real complicated. You need to be ready for that." Jeremiah nodded. But his mind was already racing. Complicated was better than hopeless. At least now there was something to fight for, something worth protecting. As darkness crept over the ranch, Jeremiah stood alone by the dig site, the cool night wind brushing against his face. In the distance, Shadow paced slowly along the fence line. There was something in the way the horse moved, restless, alert, and in that moment Jeremiah felt it too. Someone or something was watching, and whatever had been buried here wasn't meant to be found. That night, Jeremiah couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The ranch had always been quiet after dark, but now the silence felt loaded, like the land itself was holding its breath. Shadow stayed close to the house, ears twitching at the slightest sound. Even the wind, usually a constant companion, had settled into an eerie stillness. Jeremiah lay awake on the old leather couch, the oil-stained map Marcus had left spread out on the coffee table. He stared at the north pasture, where decades of secrets were now bleeding to the surface. In the early hours of the morning, a soft knock startled him from a half-sleep. He grabbed his shotgun and opened the door, expecting Marcus, but found no one. Just the vast, empty dark. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the fields. That's when he saw it, the barn door swaying open, though he was certain he'd locked it. Heart pounding, he walked slowly across the dirt yard. Shadow stood by the fence, staring intently at the structure, ears pinned back. Inside the barn, everything looked untouched until he noticed the footprints in the dust. Not his. Not Marcus's. Bare feet. Small. Too small for a grown man. The sight triggered a memory so old it came like a ghost. Jeremiah, maybe 10 years old, hearing his grandfather shout at his father about digging too deep. A girl who had gone missing. A field they were never to enter again. His grandfather had spoken of the land like it was cursed, as if something evil slept beneath it, waiting to be disturbed. Jeremiah had forgotten about those stories, dismissed them as old man's ramblings. But now, with oil seeping up and strangers wandering his property in the dead of night, those stories no longer seemed so far-fetched. He backed out of the barn and locked it again, his hands shaking. The weight of everything, the oil, the history, the strange footprints, was starting to wear on him. And yet, deeper inside, something kept pushing him forward. Was it greed? Oh, or just desperation? He didn't know anymore. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not after everything Shadow had uncovered. Later that morning, Marcus returned, a grim look on his face and papers in his hand. The soil sample tested positive. It's oil, no doubt. But there's more, he said, pausing. Someone's already filed a claim on the section you're sitting on, a man named Victor Blackwell. He says his grandfather bought that corner of the land back in 1952, but the paperwork disappeared after a fire. He's threatening to take you to court if you drill. Jeremiah's blood ran cold. Blackwell. That name was poison in this county. A name that came with rumors of land feuds, bribes, and something darker. Something Jeremiah had been warned never to repeat. Jeremiah stood silent, eyes fixed on the northern horizon. Shadow let out a low, uneasy snort. The wind had picked up again, blowing from the north pasture. And in its cold breath, Jeremiah heard something he hadn't heard in decades. His grandfather's voice, trembling and firm. That land doesn't give. It takes. Victor Blackwell arrived without warning. His truck kicked up a cloud of dust as it rolled up the long drive, stopping just short of Jeremiah's porch. The door creaked open, and out stepped a man in his late 50s, tall, lean, dressed in a dark gray suit that didn't belong on ranch soil. His silver hair was slicked back, his face weathered but proud, and his eyes cold and calculating, locked onto Jeremiah like a man sizing up prey. Shadow, tied near the barn, let out a sharp, angry whinny. The horse sensed something before Jeremiah even opened his mouth. "Didn't think I'd show up in person, huh?" Victor said with a half-smirk. "I like to look a man in the eye before I take everything he has." Jeremiah didn't flinch, but inside something twisted. Victor wasn't just a name from old rumors. He was a living, breathing threat. His family had a legacy of quiet violence in the region, always circling weak landowners like vultures. Jeremiah crossed his arms. "You have no proof. That land's been in my family for generations." Victor nodded slowly. "And yet here we are. I've got affidavits, photos, even a notarized letter. My grandfather's. Yours may have buried the paperwork, but fire doesn't erase memory. My lawyers will have your ranch tied up in court before you can blink. No drilling, no profits, just dust and debt." As Victor turned to leave, he paused. "Funny thing about this land, your folks always kept it quiet. Never used it, never touched it. Makes a man wonder what they were hiding. Maybe I'll find out once it's mine." With that, he tipped his hat and drove off, leaving behind only tire tracks and the thick stench of threat. Jeremiah stood frozen for a long time. Shadow came to his side and nudged him gently, snapping him out of the haze. "He's not taking this," Jeremiah whispered, almost a vow. "He's not taking you. Not this land. Not the truth."
That night, unable to sleep, Jeremiah dug deeper into old chests, file boxes, and the corners of his father's forgotten study. In a cracked leather folder behind water-damaged deeds and brittle maps, he found something that made his heart stop. A photo, faded, almost ruined. A man, his grandfather, standing beside a drilling rig. Behind him, an oil-soaked child with wide eyes and no shoes. On the back, scrawled in fading ink, "She came up from the ground. They said it was cursed. We sealed it. God forgive us." The room went cold. Jeremiah dropped the photo and staggered back. Shadow whinnied loudly outside as if sensing the shift in the air. There was something buried on that land, something more than oil, more than legal disputes, something his family had hidden for decades. And now, with the seal broken, it was coming back. The morning after discovering the photo, Jeremiah stood in front of the north pasture with the image still clutched in his hand, now smudged with sweat and dirt. His mind ran in circles, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The barefoot child covered in oil. The words written in a hand that trembled. "We sealed it." He looked down at the soil Shadow had disturbed days before. The same ground that now reeked not just of oil but of secrets, heavy, ancient secrets. "God forgive us," the note had said. And Jeremiah was beginning to understand why. Marcus returned around noon, a fresh stack of legal documents in his hand. But the moment he saw Jeremiah's face, he paused. What happened? Jeremiah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed Marcus the photograph. His friend studied it for a long time, growing pale. "Jeremiah, this isn't just about oil. This is something else." Jeremiah nodded. "They buried more than land disputes out here, Marcus. There was a girl. Maybe more. I think something went wrong. Something they covered up. And now it's rising back up." Marcus looked toward the field, a chill creeping down his spine despite the midday heat. "You really think they sealed something in the ground?" That night, driven by a mixture of fear and need, Jeremiah returned to the dig site with a shovel in hand. Shadow followed close behind, his steps uneasy. The air felt thicker than usual, like breathing through wool. Each thrust of the shovel into the soil seemed to echo louder than it should. After nearly an hour of digging, he hit something solid. Metal, a rusted plate of iron embedded deep in the earth. He dropped to his knees, brushing the dirt away with frantic hands. Bolted shut, weather-worn and carved crudely into its surface. Do not open. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a warning. It was a plea. He stared at the bolts, his hands hovering above them. Part of him screamed to stop, to walk away and never return. But another part, the part that had endured years of silence, betrayal and loss, needed to know the truth. Not for oil, not even for survival, but for the legacy he'd inherited without understanding it. Shadow stepped forward and placed a hoof near the plate as if urging him to be sure. Jeremiah looked into the horse's eyes. They were wide, alert and afraid. At dawn, Marcus arrived to find Jeremiah sitting by the plate, exhausted and pale, the photo tucked into his shirt pocket. "We need to talk," Jeremiah said quietly. "I'm not the only one who knows about this anymore. Victor's men were here last night. They didn't touch anything but they were watching. I saw footprints. Cigarette butts by the gate." Marcus looked over his shoulder, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "You think they know?" Jeremiah nodded. "They don't want the oil. They want this, whatever this is." And now, for the first time since the oil had surfaced, Jeremiah wasn't sure if they had uncovered a blessing or awoken a curse. The tension broke just after midnight. Jeremiah had fallen asleep in his chair by the window, rifle across his lap, when a sharp banging at the barn door jolted him awake. Shadow neighed violently from his pen, hooves clashing against the stall floor. Jeremiah shot up, heart hammering, and rushed outside with the rifle raised. The barn door was open again, but this time the lock hadn't been broken. It had been melted. A pool of twisted metal lay beneath the latch, and the strong stench of burned rubber lingered in the air. Inside, hay was scattered, tools missing. The only untouched thing was Shadow, standing tall and defiant. Whoever had come hadn't dared touch the horse. That told Jeremiah everything he needed to know. Back inside, he found a note nailed to the front door. It was short, typed in bold letters. "Seal it again or you'll be buried with it." The message turned his blood to ice. This wasn't about oil rights or court disputes anymore. Someone knew exactly what was under that iron plate. They didn't want the land. They wanted it silenced. Marcus arrived an hour later and read the note without saying a word. He just looked at Jeremiah, jaw tight. "You still think this is just about property lines?" Jeremiah shook his head slowly. "No, this is about whatever my grandfather tried to keep down there, and the people who swore to keep it down." They spent the morning checking the fences, inspecting tire tracks, and gathering what little evidence they could. Marcus called a contact in the sheriff's department, but when he mentioned Victor Blackwell's name, the officer went silent. "Stay out of it, Marcus," he said before hanging up. That silence was confirmation. The local law wouldn't help. Maybe they were scared or maybe they were part of it. Either way, Jeremiah understood he was on his own again, just like when the drought came. Just like when he buried Eliza alone, with the weight of land that had never stopped taking. That evening, Jeremiah sat with Shadow in the stall, running his hand along the horse's back. "You led me here," he whispered. "You brought all this up. Maybe you knew. Maybe you were meant to." The horse lowered his head, calm like always but alert. Shadow had never shied from the unknown, and now neither would Jeremiah. "They want to scare me off," he muttered. "But I've got nothing left to lose. That plate's coming up." As the sun disappeared behind the hills, Jeremiah and Marcus returned to the site. They brought tools, floodlights, chains. It was time to see what had been hidden for generations. They worked in silence, the air thick with tension and dust. The bolts groaned as they began to give. And just as the last one popped loose, Shadow reared back and let out a scream unlike anything Jeremiah had ever heard. Pure fear, the kind that didn't come from instinct but memory. They stared at the dark space beneath the plate. The ground didn't smell like oil anymore. It smelled like death.
The moment the iron plate hit the dirt, the air changed. It wasn't just the shift in temperature. It was something deeper, like the land itself exhaled after holding its breath for decades. A low hum vibrated beneath their feet, subtle but undeniable, and Jeremiah felt it in his bones. He and Marcus stood at the edge of the opening, flashlights in hand, peering into a void that swallowed the light whole. The space below was larger than they expected, like a buried chamber carved into the earth. Shadow stood several yards away, refusing to come closer, eyes wide, legs trembling. That was a first. The stallion had always been fearless. Whatever was below them, even he didn't want to face it. Marcus went down first. A metal ladder, rusted and barely holding, led them into the earth. The descent felt endless. The air was damp, thick and foul, like something rotting had been sealed for too long. At the bottom, their boots touched compact dirt and stone. The flashlights finally caught on old wood beams, rusted tools, and broken crates. It wasn't just a chamber. It was a room, a man-made place. In the center lay what looked like an old oil drum, cracked open, its contents long dried. But beside it, partially buried in the dirt, was something else. A small shoe, leather, torn and stained. Next to it, partially buried in the dirt, were bones. Jeremiah froze. Not animal bones. Human. Small. Fragile. Time seemed to slow as he knelt, heart pounding, and lifted a tiny bracelet from the dirt. The same bracelet he'd seen in the photo. A chill went through him so sharp it nearly dropped him to the ground. The girl, she wasn't just a memory. She had been real, and someone had sealed her down here like she was part of the land's shame. Marcus stood speechless beside him, face pale. "This wasn't an accident," he whispered. "This was a cover-up. They knew. Your grandfather, he knew." Suddenly, a creak echoed through the chamber above them. Then another. Footsteps. Someone was walking around the opening. Jeremiah turned off his flashlight instantly. The two men crouched in silence, holding their breath. Dust rained down with each step above. Whoever it was, they weren't talking. They were listening. And then came the sound of metal scraping, something being dragged over the hole. The plate. Jeremiah's eyes widened. They were trying to seal it again. With them inside. Jeremiah lunged for the ladder, Marcus close behind. Dirt rained down as they climbed. They reached the top just as the iron plate slid halfway over the hole. Jeremiah threw his shoulder into it, pushing back with everything he had. A shadow moved on the other side, tall, fast, then gone. They burst out into the night air, coughing and gasping. The floodlights had been smashed. The truck tires slashed. Whoever had come prepared. They stood in the dark, the silence screaming around them. And below, in that chamber, something had started to move. The sun never truly rose that morning. A thick, unnatural fog blanketed the ranch, casting a pale gray hue over the fields. It clung to the skin, heavy and damp, carrying the faint stench of earth and something sourer older. Jeremiah hadn't slept. Neither had Marcus. They sat on the porch, eyes bloodshot, hands still dirty from the night before. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was loaded with the weight of what they'd seen. The girl. The chamber. The bones. And the unmistakable truth that something or someone had returned to make sure it stayed hidden. Shadow hadn't touched his feet. He paced near the fence like a sentry, ears flicking, nostrils flaring. It wasn't just instinct. It was recognition. As if the horse remembered something no man could. Jeremiah approached him slowly, whispering soft words. "You knew. You knew this land wasn't just dry. It was angry." Shadow nuzzled his shoulder briefly, but his gaze remained fixed on the northern pasture. He was waiting for something. Jeremiah felt it too, like thunder building beneath the ground, not in the sky. By noon, Marcus made a decision. "We can't leave that chamber open. If Victor's people come back and destroy the evidence, that girl dies a second time. We need to call someone. State authorities, media, hell. Someone from outside this place." But Jeremiah wasn't listening. His eyes had fallen on a corner of the map Marcus had left folded on the porch table. Scribbled in faded pencil was a note he hadn't noticed before. "VB paid to forget. Gate must stay closed." Jeremiah whispered the words aloud and something clicked. VB Victor Blackwell's grandfather. It wasn't just oil rights. It was hush money. Silence purchased in blood. That afternoon they returned to the chamber, this time with cameras, flashlights, and determination. The smell was stronger now, rancid and sweet like something decomposing in the heat. But the air was colder than before, too cold for a spring day in Texas. As they descended, a low sound began to echo from the walls. Not mechanical, not natural, a whisper, a hum, a vibration that felt like it came from inside their bones. And at the center of the room the bones were no longer still. The child's remains had shifted. The bracelet now lay in the open as if deliberately placed, and scratched into the wall above the remains, a new message had appeared, fresh, damp, jagged. "She remembers." Marcus stumbled back, his face pale. "This isn't just about memory. This is haunting Jeremiah. Whatever was done to her, it stained this land. That oil, it wasn't just nature. It's part of her. That's why your grandfather sealed it. That's why the horse knew." Outside, the fog thickened again, swallowing the light, the fences, even the shape of the house. Shadow let out a long, broken cry, different from anything Jeremiah had ever heard. It wasn't fear. It was mourning. A call not just to warn but to witness. Something had awakened, and now it was waiting. Jeremiah stepped outside and felt the air shift, lighter but not free. The land was still holding its breath. Shadow stood near the fence, unmoving. He hadn't eaten in days, only watched the field. Jeremiah knew now the horse hadn't just found oil. He'd revealed the truth. And that truth had a weight no man should carry alone. Jeremiah drove into town with the photo, the bracelet, and a copy of his grandfather's confession. He dropped them at the county clerk's desk. "This land buried a child. I'm not keeping it buried." The clerk said nothing, but the silence spoke volumes. That afternoon, reporters showed up at the ranch. Victor Blackwell never did. At sunset, Jeremiah returned to the chamber one last time. He dropped a single flower into the hole and whispered, "I'm sorry." Then he covered the opening, not with concrete but with wood and wildflowers. It would stay closed but not forgotten. The girl's name was still unknown, but now the land would remember. Shadow walked beside him. His steps were calmer now. Jeremiah stopped near the barn and looked at him. "I almost gave you away," he said softly. "But you never gave up on me." Shadow leaned in, eyes calm. No words needed. Some bonds ran deeper than blood, deeper than fear. Jeremiah kept the ranch. The oil was real, but he refused to drill near the chamber. The money came from the rest of the land. Enough to breathe, enough to rebuild. He repaired the fences, fixed the roof, and planted flowers over the forgotten place, not as a grave but as a reminder. And every morning Shadow stood by the field, watching, guarding, not the oil, not the past, but the truth. The wildflowers Jeremiah planted over the chamber bloomed with unusual vibrancy, as if nourished by something more than just soil and sunlight. People in town noticed the change in the north pasture, how it shifted from barren to lush in a single season. Some said it was the oil beneath, others whispered about the girl whose story had finally been told. But Jeremiah knew it was something else entirely. It was acknowledgement. The land was healing. Victor Blackwell disappeared shortly after the reporters came. Some said he fled to Mexico, others claimed he'd moved to a high-rise in Dallas. The truth was simpler and darker. He'd been found in his office, a typed confession on his desk and an empty bottle of whiskey beside him. The confession detailed how his grandfather had been involved in the death of the girl, how the Blackwell fortune had been built on silence and stolen land. The authorities ruled it suicide, but the old-timers knew better. The land had found its reckoning. Jeremiah received a letter from Victor's attorney a month later. The disputed claim had been dropped. The letter included a yellowed photograph, the same girl from Jeremiah's photo, but alive, smiling, standing beside a small pump house. On the back, a name, Eleanor Thompson, 1952. Finally, she had a name. Marcus helped Jeremiah establish a small but steady oil operation on the southern portion of his land, far from Eleanor's resting place. The money came in steadily, enough to breathe life back into the ranch. Jeremiah fixed the roof, replaced the broken windows, and painted the house the same soft yellow Eliza had always wanted. Shadow seemed to grow younger with each passing day. His coat regained its glossy sheen, his eyes their sharp intensity. He carried Jeremiah across the fields each morning, always pausing at the edge of the wildflower patch as if paying respects. The locals stopped calling it the Hawkins Ranch. They started referring to it as Shadow's Place. Children left flowers by the fence. Strangers wanted to see the horse that had uncovered both fortune and truth. Some even claimed to see a small figure walking alongside Shadow in the early morning fog, a barefoot girl with flowers in her hair. Jeremiah's daughters returned that summer. They brought their children, who raced through the fields and brushed Shadow's mane with the same gentle hands their grandmother had once used. "It's different now," his eldest daughter said one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky crimson. "The land feels peaceful," Jeremiah finished. "It remembers, but it forgives." That autumn, as the wildflowers began to wither with the season's change, Jeremiah had a proper marker made for Eleanor. Not a traditional headstone, but a small bronze plaque embedded in a natural stone. It read simply, "Eleanor Thompson, remembered by the land." He placed it at the edge of the wildflower field, where the chamber lay beneath. Shadow stood beside him, steady and calm, as Jeremiah knelt to secure the plaque in place. "She deserved to be known," he whispered. That night, rain fell for the first time in months, a gentle, steady shower that soaked the parched earth without flooding it. The kind of rain farmers pray for. Jeremiah sat on the porch, watching droplets collect on the newly painted railings, listening to the rhythm of water against the roof. Shadow stood in the field, face tilted toward the sky, letting the rain wash over him. He didn't seek shelter. He didn't need to. This wasn't just weather. It was absolution. In the years that followed, the Hawkins Ranch became known not just for its oil, but for its wildflowers, its vibrant crops, and the black stallion that seemed to never age. Visitors came from counties away to see the place where a horse had uncovered both fortune and justice. Some claimed the land was blessed. Others said it was haunted. Jeremiah knew it was neither, it was remembered. And that was enough. Jeremiah lived another 15 years, long enough to see his grandchildren grow tall, to help his daughters manage the ranch, to watch Shadow run the fields with the same energy he'd always had. When his time came, it was peaceful. Sitting on the porch at sunset, Shadow grazing nearby, the wildflowers swaying in the gentle breeze. They buried him beside the wildflower field, not far from Eleanor's plaque. The funeral was well attended. The entire county came to pay respects to the man who had listened to the land. As the crowd dispersed, Shadow broke free from his pen and galloped to Jeremiah's grave. He stood there, head bowed, for hours. People tried to lead him away, but he wouldn't budge. Not until the moon rose high and full over the Texas plains. Then something strange happened. A mist rose from the wildflower field, soft, silvery, almost luminous. Those who witnessed it would later struggle to describe what they saw. Some said it was just moonlight playing tricks. Others swore they saw a girl walking beside a tall man, leading Shadow away from the grave and toward the north pasture. By morning, Shadow was gone. No tracks led away from the ranch. No broken fences. He had simply vanished, as if he'd completed what he'd come to do. The ranch passed to Jeremiah's daughters, who continued his legacy. The oil pumps ran steadily. The fields produced bountiful crops. The wildflowers bloomed each spring, more vibrant than any in the county. And sometimes in the early dawn or late dusk, when the light plays tricks on the eyes, people claimed to see a black stallion running across the fields, a barefoot girl on his back, her laughter floating on the breeze. Not a ghost story to frighten children, but a reminder of what the land remembers, both the darkness and the light, the sorrow and the healing. The Hawkins Ranch stands to this day, a testament to the truth that some bonds run deeper than blood, deeper than fear, deeper even than death itself. The land remembers, and in remembering, it forgives. But it never forgets.